Imagine a conflict so vast that it reshaped the world map, redrew alliances, displaced millions, and defined the very idea of what modern war looks like. A war so complex, so relentless, that its echoes are felt from Kyiv to Washington, from Europe to every corner of the global economy. This is the story of the Russia-Ukraine war, how it began, how it grew into one of the defining conflicts of the 21st century, and how its consequences continue to unfold as this documentary begins. In the winter of 2013, a wave of protests surged through Kyiv's Maidan Square, driven by a nation torn between East and West, yearning for democratic reforms and closer ties to Europe, while resisting creeping influence from Moscow. This movement, known as the Euromaidan, challenged the old political order and set Ukraine on a path it had never fully walked before, toward independence not just in name, but in spirit. But the promise of change alarmed Russia's leadership, who saw Ukraine's pivot toward the West as a strategic threat, a slipping grip on a neighbor long regarded as part of its sphere of influence. In February 2014, when Russian forces entered and annexed Crimea, the world watched in shock as a peninsula long recognized internationally as part of Ukraine was absorbed into the Russian Federation, setting off the first major clash that would define decades to come. This annexation wasn't just a territorial grab, it was a rupture in the post-Cold War order, a warning that old lines drawn on maps could still be contested by force. From Crimea's peninsular hills to the industrial valleys of Donetsk and Luhansk arose armed separatist movements, backed and supported by Moscow, who sought to carve out breakaway regions under the banner of new republics in eastern Ukraine. While Ukrainian forces struggled to contain these insurrections, the conflict simmered and boiled over, spilling into open battle and killing thousands before the world could fully grasp the scale of what was unfolding. What began as a localized insurgency evolved into a protracted war, a tinderbox ignited by geopolitics, identity, and history. On February 24, 2022, the conflict leapt across every boundary it had previously respected when Russian armed forces launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In the gray pre-dawn hours, missiles and artillery hammered Ukrainian cities, airports, and military installations. Columns of armored vehicles surged across borders from the north, east, and south, their tracks etching the starts of lines that would soon be drawn into battle maps across the world. The reasons given by Moscow were painted in broad geopolitical strokes: denazification, security concerns, prevention of NATO expansion, language that rang hollow in capitals across Europe and beyond, where leaders saw a blatant violation of sovereignty and international law. What followed was staunch Ukrainian resistance that surprised many observers and galvanized international attention. Ukraine's military, outnumbered and outgunned in many theaters, refused to yield, fighting fiercely from Kharkiv to Kyiv itself, turning cities into bulwarks and citizens into determined defenders. What was meant to be a quick campaign to decapitate the Ukrainian government ground into months of harrowing urban warfare as villages and towns became names etched in headlines and human loss. As the invasion rolled on, the world awakened not only to the brutality of modern war, but to a new form of resilience that refused to be crushed. The early battles of 2022 set the tone for how this conflict would be fought: fierce, unpredictable, and devastating. In the east, the Battle of Donbass consumed spring and summer, drawing the attention of global strategists and historians alike. What was once a region of factories and mining communities became ground zero for tank columns and artillery barrages, as both sides fought for control of key cities, towns, and the strategic terrain that could decide the future of the front. Casualties mounted on both sides, and the human toll became impossible to ignore. Soldiers killed or wounded by the tens of thousands, civilians caught in crossfire, families displaced, and communities erased from familiar maps. By this point, international sanctions had turned economic screws around Russia, targeting energy, finance, and trade to pressure Moscow into reconsidering its campaign. Yet these efforts did little to staunch the flows of conflict. Ukraine, bolstered by military aid from Western allies, from advanced anti-tank weapons to air defense systems, fought relentlessly to hold its ground, even as Russian forces adapted and pressed on. Meanwhile, the war's industrial scale began to reshape every aspect of life on both sides, draining resources, disrupting economies, and reminding the world that modern war is not confined to battlefields alone. The echoes of artillery reverberated through global markets as energy prices surged, supply chains buckled, and the geopolitical landscape realigned around this conflict's unpredictable demands. As 2023 and 2024 unfolded, the war settled into a grinding pattern of attrition, with neither side achieving a decisive breakthrough. On Ukraine's front lines, the defense became as much about innovation as determination, with drones, electronic warfare, and fast-moving missile strikes shaping battles in ways that traditional strategy had never fully anticipated. The sinking of the Russian Black Sea flagship Moscow in April 2022, struck by Ukrainian-supplied missiles, became a watershed moment, signaling that even the once mighty fleets were vulnerable in this new age of asymmetrical warfare. The front lines shifted incrementally from one sector to another, gains here, losses there, as both armies recalibrated their tactics. In southern Ukraine, fierce fighting around Huliapoli and the neighboring villages demonstrated how every meter of land would be contested, costing thousands of lives for ground that on a map might seem insignificant, but in the narrative of war became deeply symbolic. Likewise, in the north and east around Borova, Kupiansk, Sumy, and dozens of other contested sectors, localized offensives and counteroffensives kept momentum from swinging dramatically for either belligerent, turning the conflict into a landscape of stalemates and costly advances that mirrored trench warfare of century past, albeit with high-tech tools and digital connectivity. But wars are not fought only on the battlefield. They are fought in capitals and council chambers, under the bright lights of diplomacy and the ever-watchful gaze of global opinion. Throughout 2025 and into 2026, attempts to end the fighting materialized in intermittent peace talks, led by foreign mediators in venues from Abu Dhabi to Geneva. These negotiations brought moments of hope, such as prisoner exchanges and agreements to continue dialogue, yet they also revealed profound divides, chiefly over territorial control and the future status of regions like Donbass and Crimea, that neither side was prepared to concede. While these talks endured, global leaders wrestled with what peace might mean for a country whose future had been rewritten by years of conflict. On the home front in Ukraine, the human cost of this relentless war was everywhere. Cities such as Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, and many others bore the scars of repeated air and drone strikes, which damaged energy infrastructure and civilian buildings alike, leaving communities struggling for heat and light amid harsh conditions. Russian air assaults, often deploying hundreds of drones and missiles at a time, aimed not just at military targets, but at the infrastructure that kept everyday life functioning, turning winter nights into hours of blackout and uncertainty. In the sum of these attacks, thousands of civilians were killed or wounded, and millions more were displaced from their homes, seeking refuge abroad or in safer corners of their own land, reshaping populations and family histories irrevocably. This mass movement of people, one of the largest in Europe since World War II, transformed cities and borders as refugee centers and aid networks surged to meet the enormity of need. Beyond the battlefield, Ukrainian society endured, rebuilt, adapted, and held on to a sense of identity that fortified resistance and resilience in ways that resonated far beyond its own borders. Russia, too, felt the war's deep impact, not just in its battle losses, but in its economy, society, and global standing. With military expenditure ballooning and economic growth stalling, the Kremlin faced mounting internal pressures even as it pressed forward with its strategic objectives. Although Russia's official estimates of casualties and losses remained closely guarded, external analyses suggested staggering figures, with total casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing, on both sides spiraling into the hundreds of thousands, making this conflict one of the deadliest in Europe in generations, and possibly the highest in terms of Russian military losses since World War II. Amid these losses, voices within Russia, from members of the public, social figures, and political commentators, began calling for an end to the war, highlighting the personal toll it exacted not just on Ukrainians, but on Russian families as well. The war's pressures also revealed deeper fissures in domestic policy and economic stability, forcing the leadership to confront the limits of sustaining a long-drawn confrontation, while society demanding answers about a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. Across the world, this war reshaped alliances and sharpened geopolitical divides. NATO countries and EU partners strengthened their defensive postures in Eastern Europe, sending aid and modern weaponry to Ukraine, while balancing concerns about escalation. The conflict served as a stark reminder that even in the 21st century, territorial aggression and power politics could erupt into large-scale conflict with global ramifications. International bodies grappled with questions of sovereignty, international law, and the very definition of security, while global markets responded to disruptions in energy supplies and agricultural exports that rippled through economies near and far. The war's impact was not confined to Europe. It forced nations worldwide to reevaluate their strategic priorities and diplomatic alignments in an era marked by shifting power dynamics, technological warfare, and contested borders. Meanwhile, on the ground in Ukraine, the lines between war and diplomacy blurred as leaders and citizens alike pondered what peace would actually mean for a country whose future had been rewritten by years of conflict. And yet, as the war of 2026 unfolds, there remains no definitive end in sight. Battles continue, territories shift, and each setback or advance is etched into the larger narrative of a conflict that has become both a tragedy and a testament to the resilience of a people determined to define their own destiny. While new technologies like long-range missiles and drone swarms play an ever greater role, it is the human stories of courage, loss, hope, and endurance that shape the heart of this war's history. From the front lines to the halls of negotiation, from families in bombed-out neighborhoods to leaders on global stages, the Russia-Ukraine war stands as a stark reminder that the pursuit of peace is often as challenging as the battles that compel it. And though the chapters of this war are still being written, their lessons are already clear: that sovereignty, identity, and the value of human life remain at the center of any conflict, no matter its scale or complexity. As we stand here today, years into a war that reshaped nations and alliances, we must remember the people behind the headlines, the families whose lives were disrupted, the soldiers who fought not just for land, but for a future they believed was worth defending. This conflict is more than lines on a map. It is a story of human endurance in the face of unrelenting adversity. If this documentary has given you a deeper understanding of how the Russia-Ukraine war began, how it unfolded, and how it continues to affect millions around the world, then share this story, discuss it with others, and seek out the voices of those who lived through it. For peace begins with awareness, and awareness begins with watching and learning. If you want more deep-dive historical documentaries like this one, make sure to subscribe and enable notifications so you never miss an episode. History is happening now, and understanding it is our first step toward shaping a better tomorrow.